How do you send messages in a world without magic? Stick around and we'll find out. Welcome everyone to Funky Monkey MP, the place where you get your weekly dose of miniature painting, history and world building. Before we get to today's topic, let us talk about the miniature being painted today. This is Barnabas, the Korat paladin from Animal Adventures Tales of Cats and Catacombs. And with that, let us begin. As you can imagine, in ancient times and medieval times, it wasn't that easy to send messages. Actually, for thousands of years, it was quite difficult to send messages over great distances. This came to an end more or less with the introduction of the telegraph around 1830s, 1840s, so mid-19th century. Before this, it was quite challenging. Of course, there were some methods. One could, of course, purchase the services of professional couriers, but not everybody had access to that kind of funds. You could employ the services of royal or imperial couriers. Again, not everybody was able to or allowed to. Or you could approach merchants and ask them to carry messages over greater distance if the receiver was on their route. You could also approach other individuals from your community who were traveling to different settlements. And within cities, you could employ the services of runners. Imagine street urchins that, in exchange for a few coins, would deliver messages within the city proper. Of course, if you're in shady businesses, you would bribe individuals to carry that message for you, being couriers, being merchants, or if you were wealthy enough, you would have your own messengers. But nonetheless, if you wanted to send messages over greater distances, it could take days, weeks, even months for your message to reach if it actually reached its destination. But what if you wanted to raise the alarm? You wanted to signal that the enemy is coming. You wanted to send a very short, very rudimentary message. Well, people are quite inventive. I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment. Before we continue, let's talk about the mini. With the leather elements now completed, I am working on the armor using a mix of Stormhost Silver and Altdorf Guard Blue. It's a custom color. Let us begin the list of signaling methods with bonfires. I'm sure that if you've seen the Lord of the Rings trilogy, you will remember the moment when a call for help was sent from Gondor to Rohan. A bonfire was lit within Gondor, and then a chain reaction started with other signaling fires being lit from mountaintop to mountaintop until it reached their allies. Of course, as you can imagine, there are multiple shortcomings to this system. First, the message you're sending is very rudimentary. You can convey only one message. Either help, the enemy is coming, send reinforcements, or whatever both parties agree upon. That is one of the shortcomings. Another one is that once the alarm is raised, once the fire is lit, it's quite difficult to extinguish it. This means that you need to ensure that false alarms are not being sent out. This brings me to another shortcoming. You had to station individuals who were very well trained, very reliable and very brave, and were seasoned in war. You needed somebody who didn't see a small skirmishing or raiding party and order the mobilization or signal the mobilization of the whole army. You needed people with battle experience who wouldn't lose their cool. Another shortcoming was that once the fire was lit, the enemy definitely knew you were onto them. This meant that they had time to either change tactic, create diversions, or simply withdraw and harass the defenders by doing this multiple times. Another problem is that depending on the geography, these bonfires had to be on high ground to be able to be visible from great distances. Another thing was that you needed to set them up in places that were easily defendable and were hard to infiltrate. You wouldn't want enemies to take out your guardsmen and make sure that the chain is interrupted. And last but not least, you needed to make sure that the material was still flammable. Imagine that usually you would have high stacks of wood set in place, and you only needed to set them ablaze. If it had been raining for 2 weeks, you needed to make sure that that wood was still flammable. You wouldn't want an enemy attack to begin and you not be able to light the damn thing. These are some of the shortcomings of bonfires, but let's talk about the advantages as well. Before we do so, let's talk about the Mini for a bit. After adding some more Stormhost silver to the custom color I have already made, I am now adding highlights to larger panels of the armor, trying to catch the light. I'm sure you're wondering what's the minimum distance between two bonfires so that they can actually be intervisible. The answer was given in the late 19th century, so around 1880s, 1890s, during the US Coastal and Geodetic Survey. It has been shown that under the right circumstances and in the right conditions, the visibility is around 260 kilometers to 320 kilometers. That is roughly between 160 and 200 miles. And you wouldn't see that much, but you would be able to see, under the right conditions, a lit bonfire. Of course, when I say the right conditions, it means during winter, on a clear day when the temperature is really low and across water. These are the basic conditions to be able to see almost 320 kilometers or 200 miles away. Of course, most bonfires were not that far apart from one another. Now let's talk about the oldest recorded signaling chain here in Europe. It comes from the book Agamemnon, written by Aeschylus. It is said to be the signaling chain that announced the fall of Troy. Once the Greeks were victorious, bonfires were lit from mountaintop to mountaintop and from isle to isle until it reached Athens and Argos. The book was originally published in 458 BCE, before Common Era, and it lists the signaling posts, as you can see here. The greatest distance between two such signaling posts was of 173 kilometers, or roughly 107 miles, and the shortest was 21 kilometers, or around 13 miles. And with that, let us talk about the miniature for a bit, and then we'll move on. With the armor now done, I am using lead belcher to highlight the edges of each individual panel in order to slowly build up highlights and accentuate the armor. With the bonfire out of the way, let us talk about something more inventive: water clocks. This is a bit of a more creative method and a little bit more difficult to explain, so bear with me. You have two identical pots. They can hold the same amount of water and both have corked holes at the bottom. On the inside, they have identical markings. Each marking is numbered. Upon starting the message, the sender waves a torch to signal the incoming message. the receiver acknowledges by waving a torch. The sender then hides the torch behind a screen to obscure it. The moment the torch vanishes, both sender and receiver remove the cork and water starts dripping out. The moment the desired marking is reached, the sender signals with the torch again, and both sender and receiver recork the bottom of the pot. Now, the receiver simply verifies the level of water, acknowledges the marking, and interprets the message. The second method is almost identical, but instead of markings on the inside of the pot, you use a notched rod of wood. Well, two. One for the sender, one for the receiver. The moment the sender wants to send a message, they wave the torch, the cork is removed on both sides. When the message is done, the sender signals with the torch again, the cork is placed, the notch is counted, the message is interpreted. The problem with this method is, of course, as you can see, the pots have to be identical. The holes at the bottom have to be identical. The same amount of water has to be in both pots, although this can be easily overcome by having a mark on the inside for the default level of water. And another very important problem is that once you finished sending a message, you need to refill the pots, both pots, with water. This means that you have to have a larger supply of water or a constant supply of water, such as a stream or a spring. Moreover, the two observation posts have to be close enough so that a torch could be visible from both ends. And although this method is a little bit more difficult to maintain, of course offers a wider variety of messages, which in itself is quite an advantage. Depending on the number of markings inside the pot or the number of notches on a rod, one could have multiple messages such as send reinforcements, enemies incoming, they are mounted, they come from the north, etc. Another shortcoming for the first method is that in order to see the markings inside the pot, the mouth of the pot has to be wide enough so you could peer inside. An upgrade to the second method would be to have the rod float in the water, bob in the water, and as the water flows out, the rod simply lowers until it reaches the lip of the pot, and that is the message you are reading. And with that, let's move on to semaphore. In ancient times and in medieval times, flags were used to convey different messages, both on the battlefield and when sending messages. The shortcomings are that you need highly trained people to be able to properly convey all the messages. As you can see here, you attribute flag positions to letters. You can spell out whole sentences, but it takes time, it takes a lot of training to do so, and individuals need to be quite close to one another to be able to properly read the messages. But it's interesting. Before we move on, let's talk about the miniature. With the armor now completed, I am working once again on both the fur and the leather elements of the miniature, deepening the shadows, bringing more detail. Let's talk about mirrors. Nowadays, a 30 centimeters or roughly 12-inch in diameter mirror could catch the light and reflect it at very great distances. Actually, it could work up to 305 kilometers or roughly 190 miles away. In ancient times, of course, they didn't have the same technology when it came to crafting mirrors. As such, they would usually use sheets of very well polished metal. In conjunction with torch or bonfire, they could use sheets of metal to redirect light and signal. Of course, when using light, you need to make it pulse in order to allow the receiver to decipher the message. For this purpose, in ancient times they would employ screens made out of wood, textile, leather or any other kind of material. This came with some drawbacks. As you might imagine, the greater the distance over which you wanted to convey a message, the greater the sheet of metal and the greater the fire. This meant that it required a lot of work, a lot of room, specialized individuals who were able to send a message and also to decipher it, as well as the crafting part. It wasn't easy to craft large sheets of metal for this purpose as it is today. Now let's move to a more complex, actually one of the most complex method of sending messages. Complex torch systems. I'm gonna try and go quickly through these. Imagine 10 torches divided in 2 groups of 5. In order to make them blink in and out, you need screens made of different materials, as mentioned before. They were set 10 meters or 30 feet before the torches, while the torches themselves looked like this. An A-frame, large pole, counterweight at one end, the fire at the other. Each letter in the alphabet was assigned a combination of torches. For A, 1 in the left, 1 on the right. For B, 2 on the left, 1 on the right. For Z, 5 on the right, 2 on the left. This came with a whole suite of issues, as you might imagine. First off, you needed a lot of room to deploy this kind of systems. This meant that these systems were deployed only in very well defended areas, very well established bases such as legionary camps or perhaps even cities. After this, you require very highly skilled individuals to send the message and to decipher. Moreover, there is something called the minimum resolvable visual acuity. This is a very fancy way of saying that at a distance, 2 light sources are seen as one. In order to send a message using this system over almost 4 kilometers, roughly 2.5 miles, these 2 groups needed at least 8 meters or 24 feet between them. The further you went, the further the groups had to be. This system was described by the Greek historian Polybius in the 1st century CE. 100 years later, more or less, Julius Africanus, a Roman historian, described an improved method of signaling with the same system. This required only 3 torches and they were spaced 25 meters or roughly 75 feet apart from one another. Now, this system worked over greater distances, from ancient sources almost 48 kilometers or roughly 30 miles. But it brought along 3 problems. First, the minimum resolvable visual acuity. This, of course, was universal. Second, you have the lateral inversion phenomena. This is a fancy way of saying you cannot tell right from left at that distance. This was easily bypassed through one method. The sender had their back to the receiver, so their left was the receiver's left. But both issues were resolved using a very complex tool called a Dioptra. As you can see in this image, it consists of concentric circles. In the middle you have a sight, while you have markings on the outer ring marking degrees. The receiver would use the sights to center on the middle torch and then easily discern left from right at great distances. This tool was very complex and very hard to manufacture, and as such, it is believed that it was deployed only in the most important fortifications or even cities. And with that, let us talk about the miniature. And finally, with everything else done, I am working on the sword, adding gem effects to it, making it sparkle a little more. Before we wrap up today's episode, I want to clarify a few things regarding climate conditions that might impact the use of any of the methods mentioned today. First off, even during rain and snow, fire can still be seen from far away, and if that failed, thick smoke is also an option. Second, even in heavy fog, when light is not an option because it becomes diffused, thick black smoke was still an option. But also please note that most of the times these methods were also accompanied by mounted riders who would be able to give a detailed account of what's going on. Before we finish, one more thing. And with the final touches added, I am now working on the base, bringing everything together and finishing the painting. But I'm happy with it as is. 5 DPDs. I'm sure that not many of you are familiar with that name, but this individual is quite important, at least to European history. He was a hemerodrome, a professional trained courier. He was sent to enlist the help of Sparta in 490 BCE when the Persians landed at Marathon. He ran 240 kilometers or 150 miles over 2 days to Sparta. He then ran back. He was sent to the battlefield of Marathon, 40 kilometers away or 25 miles, and then he ran back with one message: Nikome, we're victorious. He then collapsed and died. Modern day marathons are named after his achievement. And with that, thank you so much for the privilege of your time. Please like, subscribe, share, leave a comment, hit the bell, and I'll see you all here next week on Funky Monkey MP. Have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful day. Cheers.